Well, today we're going to be looking at a Wittnauer watch that was sent in to me by one of my channel supporters. And he said that he's having problems winding the watch. Now, this is not a particularly expensive watch, but not everyone wears a Rolex, so it obviously has a lot of meaning to him. So I decided to go ahead and get it fixed for him and go ahead and service and regulate it as well. The one issue he knew about in this watch, which is a manual wind movement, is that it continues to wind without stopping. Now, the watch would run, but it had a very short power reserve. When I tested the winding, I could almost feel the spring slip like it would with an automatic mainspring. And when I listened to it, I could even hear it as it was happening. Wittnauer's claim to fame was its all-proof case design, which is what this watch is. It was actually worn by a daredevil aviator named Jimmy Mattern, who was wearing this watch when he was trying to circumnavigate the globe in an airplane back in 1933. Ending up in the water, Jimmy was quoted as saying afterwards, "After my plane crashed and I had to wade and swim in some rivers, it proved absolutely waterproof. It kept up a true performance when I was lost to civilization for many days." Wittnauer capitalized on this event and marketed the All-Proof with the claim, "Dropped 3,400 feet from an airplane, exposed to rain for 30 hours, and still running perfectly." The All-Proof is a monocoque case, meaning that the movement has to come out of the front of the case. So the first thing we need to do is release the stem from the movement. In order to release the stem from a monocoque case, you either need to have access to a stem release button like this one, or you can have a two-piece stem like the one on this watch, where you can actually see the two parts of the stem once the crystal and the bevel are removed. With this, all you have to do is turn the crown until the opening of the female part of the stem is facing up, and then you just lift the movement out. The other option, and what we have, is a two-piece stem like this one that actually just snaps together. The first two styles must have a bezel of some sort to cover up the gap between the edge of the dial and the case. So when you have a minimalistic watch like this, no bezel, you can be fairly certain that the two parts of the stem actually snap together. Now, with the stem out of the way, now we can remove the crystal. And to do this, I'm just going to use a simple crystal lift. For whatever it's worth, this thing is a real piece of crap. But all I want to do is get the crystal off of the case. I haven't even owned the Bergeron version before, so I don't know how much better it is. But I've never really liked the idea of squeezing a watch crystal or compressing the watch crystal with something that has sharp points on it. And since I'm going to use a different method to reinstall this crystal anyway, I don't really need one. Next, I wanted to show you some damage to the watch dial because this is something that people ask about all the time. Can it be fixed? And the answer is always no. The only thing you can do is have the dial professionally refinished. Now, in this case, something has gotten under the clear coat, and really any attempt to remove this damage is going to ruin what's left of the dial. Not to mention the fact that it's barely even noticeable when you're just looking at it visually. You might even notice on the underside of the dial here by the stem some discoloration, which more than likely is a result of over lubrication somewhere in the watch, probably around the stem, that's worked its way around to the front of the dial, and that's what caused the damage. Now, as we look at the balance side of the movement, you can see the importer's code, AXA, which identified Wittnauer as the importer of this watch movement. You'll notice the movement is marked as 10M, which was the caliber that Wittnauer assigned to it. But if I'm not mistaken, this movement is actually the Pazoo 7000, which was developed and used in a lot of ultra thin watches of the time. Pazoo was later absorbed into the ETA group, and they redesigned the 7000, which was a slow beat movement, and they redesigned it into a fast beat movement, which is now known as the ETA 7001. And the top tier version of the 7001 is used by many manufacturers today, including Omega and Black Pawn. You may have also seen that this is the unadjusted Swiss version of the 7000. So it's really considered kind of a low tier movement. So we'll have to see what kind of performance we can get after the service. I think on this one, I'm going to address the mainspring problem first. So we'll start by letting down the mainspring. And since this doesn't have a stem in it, I'm just going to use my screwdriver and insert it into the screw for the ratchet wheel to let the tension off the click spring while it unwinds. Now, after removing the balance and pallet fork, I can now remove the crown wheel. Notice the double screws, eliminating the need for the single reverse threaded screw. And now the ratchet wheel. I'm going to remove the click spring just so it doesn't get lost. After removing the 3 screws, I can remove the barrel bridge. And now the mainspring barrel. With the barrel cover facing up, I'm just going to gently push down on the edges of the barrel. And because the barrel arbor is sitting on the bench block, it'll force the cover out of the barrel. You can use tweezers to remove the barrel arbor, but I typically like to use this sliding pin vise, especially when the arbor is held tightly in the center coil. They are far less likely to go flying off into the abyss with this tool. Now, with the arbor out of the way, I can gently walk the mainspring out of the barrel. We can obviously see that the mainspring is not broken anywhere along its length. And now I can clearly see that it is broke right at the very end where the tab is that locks the mainspring to the barrel wall. This little tab is essentially just a little piece of mainspring that's spot welded onto the end of the mainspring. And what it does is it locks itself into the recess part of the barrel wall, stopping the mainspring from slipping once the mainspring is fully wound. And you can see where it broke off right here. Before I install the new mainspring, I'm just going to hand clean the parts for the barrel. This will be the final cleaning for this mainspring barrel, so I'm going to use fresh 99% IPA and a cleaning brush. And then I'm going to clean them again with fresh IPA before I dry them. After sourcing the new mainspring, I'm ready to put it in. If you've forgotten your spring's orientation, okay, whether it's left or right, you just need to set the arbor in its correct position, then look and compare the inner coil of the mainspring to make sure it will be catching the hook in the right direction. Now, once your new spring's orientation is correct, go ahead and remove the arbor and lay the new mainspring into the barrel. Using a pair of bronze or brass tweezers, I just push down on the middle of the mainspring, and then using a small tapered brass rod, I push down on the very end of the mainspring where the hook is, and the rest of the mainspring just follows right behind it into the barrel. Since this is a new modern style mainspring, it doesn't need any lubrication, but I will pre-lubricate the arbor prior to installing it into the inner coil. Using the sliding pin vise enables us to verify that the hook on the arbor is catching on the inside hole of the mainspring. You can see it turning right here. Then it's just a matter of lubricating the top of the arbor before we put the cover on. Now I can reinstall the mainspring, the bridge, the click spring, the ratchet wheel, and now the pallet fork. Now, with the pallet fork in, I'm going to finish winding the mainspring until it stops, and then I'll install the balance. Since we now have a functioning mainspring, I'm just going to finish the disassembly, clean all the parts, put it back together, and lubricate everything, and we'll pick this up after it runs for 24 hours. Once the movement has been cleaned, reassembled, and lubricated, I'm going to fully wind the watch, and now I'm just going to let it run for 24 hours so that all the oils can settle in, the mainspring can stretch out. And since that's already been done, now we're going to start analyzing our data. Two terms that I want you to know that are related to testing times. Now, 0 hour is when the watch is been fully wound. And of course, 24-hour is after it's been fully wound and then it's run down for 24 hours from the full wind. Okay, so the first test we're going to do is the 24-hour test. And what we're looking for here in a manual wind movement is we want to see an average amplitude in the vertical positions of right around 190 degrees. Now, the reason this is important is because it has a lot to do with the movement's ability to be able to keep a similar rate no matter if the amplitude is high or low. When a movement is able to do this, you're going to have much more stable rates for timekeeping. But there is a limit to how low the amplitude can be for this to be true. So manufacturers will set a minimum amplitude for watchmakers for a particular movement. And, since you're not going to have access to this kind of information, right? Because unless you're a certified watchmaker with an account with this company, we as independents use 190 degrees as the benchmark for manual wind movements. It's a benchmark for what's acceptable low amplitude at 24 hours. Because what you don't want is a movement that keeps a good rate when it's fully wound, then just have the rate start dropping off a cliff as the amplitude lowers, right? Well, you can see by looking at our numbers that our vertical rates are kind of hanging in right around 173, 174, which is a little lower than I'd like to see. It's pretty close. Our average amplitude is 185, so that's pretty good. And when I look at that 173 and the overall amplitude average, I got to count for some of this as the age and quality of the movement too. So even though 173, 174 is not ideal, I think in this movement, it may be as good as it gets, especially since I know I got the right mainspring in it. And uh, during my inspections, the side shake and all that looked good for the barrel, and the train is operating properly. So there could be something in the escapement that's robbing a couple degrees, but I think we'll just go ahead and we're going to wind it up all the way and we'll do our 0 hour testing. So I want to address something that seems to confuse some people, and that's the orientation for crown left and crown right in the mic stand. When we call out watch positions, dial up, dial down, crown left and right, crown up and down, these positions refer to a watch that's being worn on the wrist, not how it is sitting in the mic stand. Now, when a movement is put into a mic stand, 99.9% of the time, the balance is going to be facing up. If that's the way you're timing your movements, then visually, crown left and crown right are the opposite in the mic stand. I want you to just think about a watch on your wrist with your arm lying on a table. Now, this is a very natural way for the watch to be oriented. And if someone was looking at the front of your watch, the crown would be facing the left. But if you look at the way it would be sitting in the mic stand, the crown would be pointed to the right. Now, watchmakers today, they don't use the term crown up, crown down, or left or right. They use 12 up, 3 up, 6 up, or 9 up because these positions or this nomenclature, they're the same no matter if the movement is in a mic stand or if it's on your wrist. And you probably ask, why is this even important to know? Well, it's important because unless you're working on high grade movements, okay, you don't want to worry about testing crown right because crown right is the weakest of all vertical positions. Watches are almost never in the crown right position, and watch manufacturers know this. So, what they do when they design a watch movement, they try to put what is referred to as the natural disturbances in a movement. They try to design the movement so that these disturbances occur when the watch is in the crown right position. So you can see why this would be important if you're doing 5 position testing. And it's even more critical and more important when you're testing the 3 most important positions: crown up, crown left, and crown down, like we're going to be doing in this movement. All right, so here's our testing numbers from 0 hour. when you have an unadjusted movement with a single bend hairspring, we're only going to regulate the watch for 3 positions, right? That would be dial up, crown left, and crown down, or dial 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock up, however you want to look at it. But in order to make any adjustments in the beginning, we need to look at all 5 positions to see if we can make any corrections, and then we will just focus on the main 3 positions. When we look at our dial rates, we can see the delta is almost 9, which is an acceptable delta for this movement, which should be 10 or less. So we're okay there. Our dial amplitude at 264 and 278 is okay as well. Now, Swiss standards call for a minimum of 270, so we're just about there. Looking at our vertical rates now, we can see that, well, there's a poising error, and we can also see that we need to adjust the regulator pins. Now, here's one thing you have to remember. Movements which have single bend hairsprings were not really built for accuracy. Otherwise, they would have used the double bend. So it seems to reason that they're not going to spend much time poising the balance as well. So this is something that's not going to be real uncommon for this watch. But we will try to close that gap as much as possible so that we can have a decent rate at the very end. Looking at the beat era, you can see it's across the board, it's well under 1.0 milliseconds. So, from my perspective, there's no advantage in adjusting this because the only issue is how easily the watch starts running. And since this is a manual wind movement, as soon as you start winding it and moving it around, it's going to come to life. You can see now that we also have a delta rate over the 5 positions of almost 28, which is kind of in the range of what you would expect for an unadjusted movement that's this old. So, again, this is for 5 positions, and we're only really going to be considering our 3 primary positions. So, I would expect to see it much lower than that in the end. And finally, we can see our overall average for the 5 positions is about negative 14, which we will eliminate when we do regulate the primary 3 positions. And we're really going to shoot for a goal that whatever the discrepancy is, that it's going to be a positive rate. So now we're going to start testing our 3 main positions only. Our first goal is to bring crown left and crown down closer to the dial up position. And to do that, I'm going to move the regulator pins closer together. I'm using this adjustment because if I were to just move the regulator, those positions will all change in the same direction at about the same rate. So we would really not accomplish anything. When you close the regulator pins, this usually has a greater impact on the vertical positions than it does on the dial positions. The dial rates will get faster, just not as much as the vertical rates. The extent to which this adjustment will affect the vertical positions is directly related to how much lower the amplitude becomes when the watch is changed from a horizontal position to a vertical position. This drop in amplitude from horizontal to vertical creates a situation where the hairspring vibrates slower. And it is now spending less time touching those regulator pins, which changes the active length of the hairspring from where it was in the horizontal position and moves the active length of the hairspring closer to the hairspring stud, which makes the rate slow down. So that's why you're really seeing that difference. Now, it's important to be aware, though, that we're talking about theories, right? And things don't always work exactly the way you want to. Because what I'm talking about is true when the hairspring is centered between the pins, when the movement is at rest, right? So when the movement's at rest and the hairspring is centered in between the pins. But these type of adjustments may be more or even less responsive depending on where the hairspring is resting when the movement is at rest. Because if it's resting on the inner pin or if it's resting on the outer pin, that is going to change the dynamics of how the hairspring works. Now, we could leave it right here because we certainly have a good rate and we also have a good delta, but there's one more thing I'd like to show you. I prefer not having any negative rates when possible. So what I want to do is see if we can change that crown left position from a -4 to a positive rate. This can often be done by adjusting the height of the hairspring stud upward, which changes the relationship of the regulator coil to the main coil body of the hairspring. We call this a higher hairspring. And this type of adjustment is primarily going to affect only the vertical positions. This is accomplished with a very, very small change in height. And you should never adjust it high enough to throw off the hairspring being out of flat. Now, the reason this will work is because the closer to the top of the regulating pin that you get, the stiffer the pin is. Okay? As you move up the pin, the further you get or the closer you get to where the pin is mounted, the stiffer the pin gets. And it's that difference in stiffness that slightly changes the vibration rate of the hairspring. All right, so here we are with all our final numbers. You can see that the crown left position, which was -4, is now at 3.71. So it changed that roughly 7 seconds. And there was about a little over 1 second in the crown down position. And you'll also notice that the dial position just changed about 1 second. So it definitely had a much larger effect on the vertical positions. Now, our average rate is now 6, so it went up about 3 seconds a day. But you'll notice that our delta rate went down from 11.31 to 4.8. So that was almost a 6-second drop on our delta, which for me is more important, really. Because when you have a good delta rate, you're going to have a good average rate as well. So now the only thing left is we're going to go ahead and get this watch recased, and I can send it back to my friend.